A reflection for Septuagesima Sunday from the Gospel according to St. Matthew. At that time, Jesus spoke to his disciples this parable. The kingdom of heaven is like to a householder who went out early in the morning to hire laborers into his vineyard. It's a sobering thought that some of the parables of Jesus come from his own imagination, the imagination of God. We are reading what our Lord himself has devised for our edification, and that should make it very precious. It's true that a parable like the prodigal son may have historical origin. I've heard it claimed that the original story of the prodigal son ended with the father rejecting his son. And that makes the version that we know, which our Lord offers, all the more powerful as an example of forgiveness and mercy. I'm not sure that there's any source material for today's parable of the laborers in the vineyard. And I'm not sure about the interpretation being given by our Lord either, because unlike the parable of the sower, where we have the disciples given an interpretation afterwards, there seems to be no such thing in this case. The parable's left for us to interpret. We have to remember, of course, that we have a great advantage over the Protestant sola scriptura theology here. That lacks any authority in interpretation. What it means is down to me. Catholics know or should know their interpretation must be in line with tradition and the perennial teaching of the Church. Otherwise, their words are just their opinion. We also have the advantage of the Church Fathers, such as St. John Chrysostom, to turn to. And his interpretation of the meaning of the vineyard is quite striking, as we'll find out later. Before we get to that, let's ask the question of how we would see it. During the course of last week, someone explained to me the difference between being paid for work at a daily rate and being paid piecework. Many people who are not self-employed are used to seeing their salary at the end of the month in their bank account, hopefully before the mortgage or the rent payments go out. To be paid a daily rate means you have the same money whether materials have arrived for you to do the work or not. And to be paid at the end of a particular piece of work is, well, it's open to the problem of some hitch in supplies or other difficulties. You're paid for the whole job at the end. The workers in the vineyard seem to be paid a daily rate. Of course, they have not all done the same number of hours. That's perhaps how we would look at it from a purely human point of view. But let's try to interpret it more supernaturally. Protestant interpretation is that the penny each one receives is symbolic of salvation. Salvation doesn't depend upon works, and there's no differentiation due to merit. Whatever labor we may have made, at the end of the day, there is the one penny, salvation. When Luther rejected the corrupt practices of some in the Catholic Church in his day, well, he went overboard in the opposite direction. We can do nothing towards our salvation, according to this theology. Well, of course, it is unfair that some should work harder than others for the kingdom and yet all receive the same wages. And yet, paradoxically, this parable is not actually about us getting our just deserts. We know we deserve hell. It's not about payment by results, nor by daily rate. Let's ask St. John Chrysostom to interpret the vineyard for us rather differently. By a vineyard, he, Jesus, means the injunctions of God and his commandments. It is by obedience to the will of God, therefore, we can say, that we receive the reward of salvation, the penny. Obedience is so important. In fact, if we look into it, we might actually conclude that it takes a higher place than sacrifice in the economy of salvation, of atonement for sin. Let's remind ourselves of the importance of obedience to God in the Bible. There's Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. Out of obedience, Abraham is prepared to do something which goes against the mission he's been given by God. Isaac is the bearer of the promise. Now, Abraham had built altars to God where he had roamed. But God sought his obedience. And that was what the test was about when he lay Isaac on the altar. A little known story, but very powerful, is the account of Samuel and Saul, King Saul, who had started out so well. When the latter, Saul, smote the Amalekites, he didn't do it completely. He didn't do it as God had commanded. God wanted total obedience. And there's a wonderful example of excuses for why he didn't do the will of God. And I wonder if we can see ourselves in that. Can I see myself in his excuses? It comes from the book of Samuel. And Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said to him, "Blessed be thou of the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord." And Samuel said, "What meaneth then this bleating of the sheep in my ears, and the lowing of the oxen which I hear?" And Saul said, "They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to sacrifice unto the Lord thy God, and the rest we have utterly destroyed." What a wonderful bit of dissimulation there. No, he hasn't done what God asked. And the evidence is in the sounds of the animals that they have brought, oh yes, ostensibly to sacrifice. Then Samuel said to Saul, "Stay, and I will tell thee what the Lord hath said to me this night." Samuel has a huge advantage here. The Lord has spoken to him about it already. And he said to him, "Say on." And Samuel said, "When thou wast little in thine own sight, wast thou not made the head of the tribes of Israel? And the Lord anointed thee king over Israel, and the Lord sent thee on a journey, and said, Go and utterly destroy the sinners, the Amalekites, and fight against them until they be consumed. Wherefore then didst thou not obey the voice of the Lord, but didst fly upon the spoil, and didst evil in the sight of the Lord?" Saul is still not going to accept it. And Saul said unto Samuel, "Yea, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord, and have gone the way of the Lord sent me, and have brought Agag the king of Amalek, and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But the people took of the spoil, sheep and oxen, the chief of the things which should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice unto the Lord thy God in Gilgal." blame the people. Do you really think that they were going to sacrifice those things unto the Lord thy God before Samuel had caught out Saul? Listen to that expression. Didst fly upon the spoil. Samuel is accusing Saul of having that desire for the spoils of war, the things which God had told him to destroy. And Samuel said, Hath the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? And then the fruitful sentence, Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. 1 Samuel chapter 15. There we have it. What do we read in Psalm 51? The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and a contrite heart, O God, thou wilt not despise. Do good in thy good pleasure unto Zion. Build thou the walls of Jerusalem. Then shalt thou be pleased with the sacrifices of righteousness, with burnt offerings and whole burnt offering. Then shall they offer bullocks upon thine altar. Obedience and sacrifice go together, the sacrifices of righteousness. When we come to the New Testament, think about the dialogue between our Lord and his Father in the Garden of Gethsemane. The record of it is surely supernatural. The others were asleep. There, between the institution of the Eucharist, the Last Supper, in the upper room, and on the other hand, the sacrifice of Calvary, we have our Lord pleading, it appears, with the Father. And he went a little further and fell on his face and prayed, saying, O my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. There we have it, bracketed by sacrifice, the obedience of the Son. We are called to worship in spirit and in truth. When we come to Mass, can we say that? Or are we, like Saul, making excuses? Are we offering something not in obedience, but rather as evidence of disobedience? Do we allow a replacement to stand in for us, for our obedience? Perhaps we let the priest do it for us, the liturgy. Are we trying to present a sacrifice out of our disobedience? Are we looking for what we can get out of it? Let's return to the parable of today. Are we murmuring like the laborers? Giving ourselves completely is not easy. That's what obedience entails. Why do you think the laborers were paid their penny in reverse? The last first. Is it to insult the ones who came first? No. Surely it's to reveal the wrong spirit of those who came first. They should be delighted that the latecomers have also received the penny of salvation. This is what Chrysostom says. In heaven, there is no one who is thus justifying himself or blaming others Away with the thought, for that place is pure from envy or jealousy. For if when they are here, the saints give their very lives for sinners, much more when they see them there in the enjoyment of these things, do they rejoice and account these to be blessings of their own. What a different way of looking at this parable. It is God's will that we be the means of salvation for our neighbor. It's not in it for ourselves. We're not looking for an advantage. Our salvation is wrapped up with that of others, not a personal reward. Obedience and sacrifice go together. Let's make sure that when we come to the sacrifice of the Mass, that we have done the will of the Lord. Psalm 40. Then said I, Lo, I come, in the volume of the book it is written of me. I delight to do thy will, O my God. Yea, thy law is within my heart. Praise be Jesus Christ, now and forever.